Chinese President Xi Jinping shares his vision for global modernization at the opening ceremony of the Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. We'll discuss China's achievements over the last decade and what the future holds. Hello, I'm Arnold Neidem, and this is The Heat. Over the last 10 years, China's Belt and Road Initiative has brought high-quality infrastructure to Africa, Asia and Latin America and parts of Europe. It's spearheaded over 3,000 projects worth close to $1 trillion of investment. On Wednesday, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a keynote speech at the opening ceremony of the third Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. In his speech, President Xi pledged that China is opening its doors even wider to the world. We begin with this report from CGTN's Zhao Yunfei in Beijing.
It's Beijing's moment as the Chinese capital welcomes world leaders, charting the course for the common good. Chinese President Xi Jinping shared his vision of cooperation between countries under the Belt and Road framework.
We have learned that humankind is a community with a shared future. China can only do well when the world is doing well. When China does well, the world will get even better. Through Belt and Road cooperation, China is opening its door even wider to the world. An additional 80 billion yuan will be injected into the Silk Road Fund. Together, they will support BRI projects on the basis of market and business operation.
The Belt and Road Initiative has not just focused on infrastructure and trade. Cooperation has expanded to new industries such as healthcare, low-carbon energy, the digital economy, and innovation. The meeting hall is flanked by the flags of participating countries. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China's friend circle has become larger, and the initiative has brought a new path for the world to realize modernization.
The modernization we are pursuing is not for China alone, but for all developing countries through our joint efforts. Global modernization should be pursued to enhance peaceful development and mutually beneficial cooperation, and bring prosperity to all.
The Chinese president first announced the initiative during official visits to Kazakhstan and Indonesia in 2013. A decade of endeavor has left tangible outcomes. China has signed over 230 cooperation documents with more than 150 countries and 30 international organizations.
Without infrastructure, including infrastructure, there can be no development. And without development support, many developing countries will be starved of the infrastructure they desperately need. Infrastructure is the foundation of everyday life for people and economies.
There is no exaggeration in saying that the BRI has injected new vitality into the ancient Silk Road. So the BRI, put forth by China, is a mega cooperation project in the 21st century. In the next 3 years, we plan to build 1,300 kilometres of railway, and we'll open the third cross-border railway along our border with China and establish new land ports.
The chair's statement from this year's summit captures the consensus among participants and lays out the future direction of cooperation. A list of multilateral cooperation deliverables and a list of practical projects have also been released. The Belt and Road Initiative has brought far-reaching global impact in the past 10 years. This gathering has carried on the foundation, taking the friendship to the next level for the common development and prosperity. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, Beijing.
For more now on China's Belt and Road Forum, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Oregon is Yan Liang. She's a chair professor of economics at Willamette University. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a Russian affairs expert and professor of history at American University. Also in Washington, D.C., Abdullahi Boru Halake is an African security and policy analyst, and Aina Tangen is a senior fellow with the Taher Institute and chair of Asia Narratives in Beijing. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Aina, as we just heard, President Xi Jinping delivered the keynote address to the Belt and Road Forum. The president announced a further 80 billion yuan will be injected into the Silk Road Fund. What were the main takeaways for you from the president's speech?
Well, first off, understand that when the Belt and Road Initiative started, they put 40 billion in. So this is literally doubling down on the future. So what did we have there? We had, Xi, Putin, Kazakhstan, Indonesia, Argentina, Ethiopia, and the UN via Guterres, all talking. What you have here is a sampling of countries from across the world. And it really does put some flesh on what Xi Jinping has been talking about, this shared future for the world. And, I'd like to emphasize, the main thing here was China does well if the world does well. And the idea is that over 10 years, China has proven itself, not by talking about frameworks or what's going to happen in the future, but by actually doing it. And the countries that are involved, it's quite a contrast. You have over 130 countries attending, over 150 members. This is the largest grouping, and it's quite a contrast to what is happening in the Middle East, where Joe Biden is today. And, the kind of chaos that is reigning elsewhere. China is trying to bring order and some sort of hope for the future.
Yan Liang, President Xi said China will support an open world, the world economy, and will remove all barriers on foreign investment access to the Chinese manufacturing sector. Spell that out for us. What does it mean?
Yeah, good to talk to you, Anand. So I think this is really an indication that, as the global economy is still recovering slowly from the pandemic, and many countries are also erecting, protectionism policies. According to the IMF, there were 3,000 protectionist policies this year compared to just 1,000 in 2019. So against this backdrop, I think it's very important for President Xi to announce that, China is going to remain this kind of high-level opening to the rest of the world. Now, just think about the restrictions in the manufacturing sector that has already been watering down over the years. So now there are only two main restrictions in that sector. But still, I think this announcement is very important in signaling that China really welcomes the rest of the world to invest in this very highly competitive manufacturing sector, as China is going to upgrade and trying to engage in the so-called smart, intelligent manufacturing. So I think, when you look at it, China's high-tech manufacturing is growing at a rapid rate of 25% in the first 7 months of this year. And we also see a lot of foreign direct investment entering the high-tech sector in the past 2 years at an average growth rate of 18.9% per year. So I think, again, this just shows that China is firmly embracing the high-level opening and welcome the rest of the world to join China in upgrading in manufacturing and pushing the next level of manufacturing. And China would also benefit from the competition and also exchanges of ideas and technologies. So it's really a win-win cooperation.
Anton, the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, he is also among several world leaders at this very high-profile forum. Let's listen to part of President Putin's address to the forum.
I agree with the president of the PRC that the Chinese One Belt, One Road idea falls logically within multilateral efforts to strengthen creative and constructive interaction at the scale of the whole international community.
So, Anton, if we look at one of the main projects, one of the signature projects, joint projects between China and Russia, it involves the construction of the Moscow-Kazan railway. But what has Belt and Road on this 10th anniversary meant for Russia?
It means an alternate form of economic, geopolitical integration for the Russians. And it means an integration that the Russians have actually, almost consciously, I would say, had been ignoring over the past 30 years in the post-Soviet period. After the Soviet Union collapsed, starting with Boris Yeltsin, Russia sort of threw itself into Western integration at the expense of the rest of the world, at the expense of its other neighbors in Eurasia. And by the way, Vladimir Putin started his tenure as president continuing that policy. It wasn't until his third term, beginning in 2012, that things really started to change. And so the Russians are essentially diversifying and balancing their portfolio, which, by the way, as a Eurasian state, they should have really done long ago. But they are now moving with warp speed, thanks to the Chinese actually spearheading this project with their much greater economic and demographic resources. But what the Russians are giving the Chinese and the rest of Eurasia and the rest of the world is an enormous amount of natural resources and the potential for technological know-how that their earlier integration with the West had actually retarded to a certain degree because they imported all of their technology from elsewhere. Now they're looking to diversify with the help of the Chinese and of the other Asian states. We'll see how it works. But what we heard from Putin is actually something that we've been hearing from him over the past 10 years, roughly, which is the absolute necessity for Russia to integrate with the rest of the huge continent of which it is part.
And Anton, what about the optics of this gathering? You know, Anna Tangen just touched on that a moment ago. This is a very high-level gathering. And if we look at the level of cooperation between China and Russia and the fact that President Putin is in Beijing right now, do you see this perhaps evolving into a bigger, more significant strategic relationship between these two countries? In fact, they do next year celebrate the 75 years of diplomatic relations.
Anand, I think this is a manifestation of an important strategic relationship that already exists. The fact that Vladimir Putin was the second to speak at the plenary session after President Xi was already a huge honor for him to be put second after the host, who, of course, by diplomatic protocol and by human protocol, always speaks first. So this is a manifestation of a process that is already developing. And Vladimir Putin had multiple meetings with leaders from all over Asia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Mongolia. The Russians are currently with the Chinese working on a pipeline that will run through Mongolia into eastern China, in addition to the railroad that you referred to, which runs from Moscow to Kazan, which is southeast of the Russian capital. In other words, not towards Europe, but towards Asia. So the integration is well ahead, and I see this forum, as I see the meetings of the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as one data point, yet another, I should say, data point on a trajectory that points towards multilateralism.
Abdullahi, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is also at the forum, and he addressed the gathering. Let's listen to him.
The BRI, which is a laudable ambition to connect Asia, Europe, and Africa, is a significant international cooperation initiative anchored in the principles of collective progress.
So the Prime Minister there, Abdullahi, also praised China's achievements. Ethiopia will become a full member of BRICS in January of next year. China and Ethiopia also signed 12 cooperation agreements this week in Beijing. So put this in perspective for us. What has BRI meant for Ethiopia?
It means a huge deal, Adnan. I mean, I just want to say 2 points before I dive into the Ethiopian element of this. Number one, I think the world as we know it, where, Western countries are the center and the rest of the world is periphery, that world is slowly, getting out of the way. And if there is any evidence, it is this BRI meeting that we are seeing, where the rest of the world with China United States and Europe are mired in what is going on in Middle East. Number two, I think it's also a question of symbolism versus the true value. You know, the symbolism of China, the symbolism of Russia, the symbolism of majority of African countries, all in Beijing, when the West is involved in other things. Simultaneous to that, if you go through the BRI website, the level of significant agreements that were signed, that is a massive part. Let's bring to Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the diplomatic seat of the African Union. Ethiopia has got over 100 million people. The railway between Ethiopia and Djibouti it's almost close to, they spent 3.4 billion to build it, and that is close to almost 6% of Ethiopia's GDP. And for majority of these countries, including Ethiopia, they face like 5.1 billion GDP, sorry, 5.1 billion in infrastructure gap. And this is the kind of space within which BRI is being constituted. Ethiopia has got under 13% of its roads paved. And so what you have is large-scale headline infrastructure project that has got ripple effect, and it's going to be a legacy investment for both China and Ethiopia.
Aina Tangen, speaking of railways and connectivity, China says that it will speed up high-quality development of the China-Europe Railway Express and will also open a new logistics corridor across Eurasia. I mean, if we just look at some of the figures over the past decade, about 77,000 freight trains have been servicing 217 cities in 25 European countries. I mean, what kind of contribution has that made to global economic growth over this past decade?
Oh, massive, especially to those countries who have been previously landlocked and lacked access to ports where they could get their goods out to the international area. And people have to remember the Silk Road, I mean, the BRI is a two-way and intra-economic development asset. The fact that you can get things from one place to another means that you have choices. It doesn't all go to China. It goes to Europe. It goes to other places within these economic zones. And this has really created a tremendous amount of economic activity. It's an estimate that $4 trillion worth of economic development has been leveraged by the $1 trillion that China has put in. I just wanted to add something, though, here to what Yan was talking about. If you look at what the CPTPP, or formerly the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, was asking for in terms of open markets, SOE reform, government procurement, it's almost exactly what she talked about. So it seems pretty clear that China is aiming at being part of yet another economic grouping out there. But in terms of Russia, I think it would be very premature to see any kind of formal alliance, especially military. This would go against everything that she said in the speech, which is that he doesn't like this idea of blocs forming against each other. So at this point, it's all about the economics, about free and open, and not having groupings that are contrary or aggressive towards other groups.
Yan Liang, of course, this was not just a gathering of states talking to each other. There were also hundreds of business representatives from 82 countries in Beijing, and the Vice Premier, He Lifeng, he addressed hundreds of those business representatives. The Vice Premier said China will prioritize high-tech and new energy. What does that mean?
Right. So I think what that means is that the priorities and the really driving force for the future for development lies in these two areas. One is renewable or green energies, and second is high tech. So I think this is very clear that all countries need to prioritize, giving the limiting, sort of capacity to continue to invest or to borrow. And I think those are the two areas that China would focus on. And I think China has already been doing a lot of these, in addition to, the flagship kind of infrastructure projects. And again, this is very important. For example, to strengthen strengthen the Silk Road commerce platform that would really, again, help to boost digital trade and help to improve trade and investment. And when it comes to energies, I think that really goes without saying. I think with climate change, if infrastructure is not climate resilient, then they will become stranded assets in face of this climate change. So I think it's clear for China and also recipient countries that they will need to develop renewable energies, not only to achieve better energy, autonomy and sovereignty, but also really put their countries in a more sustainable future. And China has been doing this, right? They have been building, wind farms in Namibia or the floating solar park in Zambia. And China is going to continue to beef up the Belt and Road International Green Development Coalition. They would also, promote a lot more technological transfers and sharing, and also, like we mentioned earlier, to join force in manufacturing to produce, these very essential green products like wind turbines, like solar panel that China has a very competitive edge in. But again, this is going to be a collective effort. This is going to be collaborations with all these countries, so they will be able to put their economy in a more value-added and also green and sustainable future.
Right, Yan Liang, you were talking about e-commerce a moment ago. I mean, China is also looking at major expansion in things like AI, big data as well. What is your expectation in these sectors? I mean, China's trade with participating BRI countries reached $19 trillion over the past decade. I mean, how big is the potential?
Right, the potential is huge. Like I mentioned, this digital economy is definitely going to, put this trade relationship at a higher notch. And it's not only the improvement in trade, but also reduction in the transactions cost in terms of conducting trade, and also in terms of increasing the value added in trade. And I think, President Xi has been very ambitious. He's talked about in the next 5 years, from 2024 to 2028, trade between China and BRI partnership countries are going to increase to $32 trillion in goods and $5 trillion in service. So this is very ambitious objective, and I think there's a lot of enthusiasm and there's a lot of efforts made on the ground. So, for example, just by the CEO conference this year, there are $97 billion of contracts have been agreed on. So, in other words, I think with the investment, with the trade, with the development in tech and also renewable energies, as we mentioned earlier, I think there will be very vibrant economic futures for all the participating countries.
Anton, the president of Kazakhstan, he's also at the forum, and he was talking about major communications infrastructure development, including the construction of 1,300 kilometers of new railway tracks over the next 3 years. Our reporter talked about that at the beginning of the show. But what will that do for Kazakhstan?
Anand, it will integrate it into very profitable trade routes. Kazakhstan is an enormous country, which is sparsely populated when you consider the size of its population and its territory, and it has always sort of been on the margins of the major contemporary trade routes. This will allow the Kazakhs to become an integral part of the trade routes running from the east to the west and vice versa. It will also allow them to become integral parts of the energy framework. The Russians, Kazakhs, and Uzbeks just completed an agreement for the Russians to supply gas, not from Central Asia to the west, but in the other direction, from Russia to Central Asia. And this is an integral part of the green economy, because before all industry and humanity subsist on windmills and solar batteries, which I hope will come sooner rather than later, gas will be that bridge energy source that is cleaner than oil and certainly than coal, safer than nuclear energy. The Russians have plenty of it, and plenty of countries seem to be interested in receiving it. And Kazakhstan is going to be in the middle of a distribution network. There's also a lot of talk, of course, about the north-south corridor running from Russia through the Caucasus, but also through Central Asia down into Iran and further down. So the Kazakhs, being in the middle of Eurasia, stand to profit enormously from becoming integrated into this Chinese-led global trading network.
Abdullahi, one of the biggest and very ambitious projects that's been undertaken under the auspices of the BRI was the construction of the railway, the Standard Gauge Railway, which ran from Nairobi to the port of Mombasa in Kenya. And now Kenya is talking about expanding its railway network. I mean, what will that do, not just for Kenya, but also for the region?
Just think about it, Adnan. That railway between Nairobi city and the port city of Mombasa has reduced the travel time by a half. It has contributed to 2 to 3% of GDP. The expansion of SGR to other parts of the country means tripling it. That means you're not talking about 2, but you're talking about 6, 9% GDP figures. And the area and the regions that it is expanding to, it is, for instance, on the western part of the country to Kisumu, which then links it up with Uganda. On the other side, it is connecting the northern part of the country, which means it could easily connect Ethiopia, South Sudan, as well as Somalia. The potential is enormous. I think beyond just, the hardcore, large-scale infrastructure project, what this presents to the countries, to the regions, to some of these institutions, is an alternative pathway that is not necessarily linked to London, Brussels, and Washington. And I think that is the fundamental paradigm shift that BRI presents beyond the hard figures that it presents in terms of economic development. Never mind, this region that we are talking about is a region in the eastern part of the country, so the continent, which means it can link the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean, and on the other side to the Red Sea.
Right. Abdullahi, very quickly, I've got less than a minute actually. The United Nations Secretary General, we heard from him at the beginning of the show, and he is attending the forum as well. When we look at the BRI and its projects and its goals, how does it align with the core principles and goals of the UN Sustainable Development Goals?
It enhances UN Sustainable Development Goals. If you look at UN Sustainable Development Goals and BRI, or you can superimpose one on the other, it complements. So it's another opportunity for some of these countries to mutually benefit from trying to implement BRI versus SGD. So it's not a competition, rather it is complementary.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arland Naidu in Washington, D.C.